A while back, my contractor knew a guy who had a surplus of insulation and was offering it up at a pretty decent rate. So I jumped on the offer and bought a bunch of bundles from him. He didn't quite have everything I needed, but he had the bulk of it. After it was dropped off, I moved it all inside the workshop to store it until it could be installed. It would be a bad idea to leave it on the side yard without cover. Even though that the shop didn't have walls at the time, it was still better that there was a roof over them. Only a few days later, I finished sheathing the building to enclose the room, making the insulation better protected while being stored. Okay, so here's most of the insulation. I've got R38, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bags, and that's for these rafters on this side and on the guest house side. And then I have 5 bags of R21, and that's for the walls of the guest house. Then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bags of R19, and that's for the roof here, as well as what is it also? I'm using it for the walls in here too. And then I've got some R13, which is those bags up there, and that's for the upper attic above the R38. So all the way up there on this side and the guest house side as well. So this is most of it. I'm probably gonna have to get some more because the guy that I got it from didn't quite have enough, but that's all right. We'll start with this and then we'll go from there. At this point, the doors and windows were installed, making the building one step closer to being done. In addition to the doors, this final section of sheathing was installed. This small section of wall had to be 1 hour fire rated because of proximity reasons. Now all the exterior walls are closed up. Update on the construction. So we just passed our inspection for the rough plumbing, the rough electrical, the framing, and the doors and windows. So now the next step is insulation. Since the workshop is technically a garage, I don't have to insulate the walls, but I do have to insulate the vaulted ceiling and the flat ceiling, and then the cavities way up in the top there. I'm going to insulate the walls, but I'm just going to do it right after the inspection. So the goal is to just get everything done that is required for the inspection so we can move on to other things. Inside the guest house though, this is where I have to do a lot of insulation. So all the walls have to be like, so any exterior wall like that one has to be R19. The top of the roof there has to be R13, and then the flat ceiling is R38. And then there's some areas that I have to do R21. I'm not sure. I'll have to look at the plans, but it's time to get to work. I started with the small stuff. This is R13, and it's going above the flat ceiling into the crevices against the roof. I brought up a few bats at a time and tucked them into place. These went in relatively easy. It was just tricky maneuvering around up there with no easy floor to stand on. I did my best to fill all the spaces with insulation. When I finished the workshop side, I moved over to the guest house side and threw the same insulation up there. Though on this side, I utilized the attic entrance to get up and down. No wonder these rolls were heavy. Look how much material was compacted into the packaging. It's like baking bread in the oven. My ceiling joists are 16 inches apart, which I've learned may not be so common. I guess the norm is 24 inches apart. This insulation was meant for 24-inch on center studs, but had to be trimmed down to fit into my ceiling. Kind of annoying and time-consuming, but hey, I got a pretty good price on the insulation, so I've got to make do. Since the bat was cut down into a 16-incher and 8-incher, I could still use 2 8-inch bats side by side to fill a 16-inch space, so none of the insulation went to waste. Also, there isn't anywhere nearby that stocks 16-inch R38 insulation, so looks like I was going to have to do this anyway. Installing the bats in the ceiling was relatively easy. There's these small metal rods called installation hangers that basically pinch in between the studs and give the installation some support if needed. Some of the bats fit snugly and didn't need to be held up, but I had hangers at the ready for those that did. This step took a bit of time because all the cutting. And R38 is thick, so cutting was not so simple. I've been mentioning different values of the insulation, R19, R13, R38, etc., etc. These refer to the R value, or resistance power, of the insulation, how well the insulation can resist the transfer of thermal energy. It helps keep your house warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Different sections of a house call for different R values. Heat is known to rise, so ceilings generally have a higher R value. In this case, R38. Once all the ceiling voids were filled, I utilized the little bit of daylight left to throw up some R19 insulation on the walls. Compared to the ceiling, this went pretty darn quick because the bats just held in place without needing additional support. I first went through with full bats and put in the bottom 2 feet later on. Let's fast forward a bit because watching someone do insulation and a vapor barrier is pretty boring. So let me just explain what I did. So we got all the insulation in the walls, and then put a vapor barrier, which is a 6 mil plastic sheet over everything. Then I went through and I taped all the seams all along those edges, anywhere that there was a gap in between the pieces of the vapor barrier. And I ran out of, this is so in the walls it's R21. Over here, this is the dividing wall in between the guest house and the workshop. So it's a 2x4 right here, it's 2x6 over there. But this is R13. So this is a sound control insulation to help kind of dampen the sound a bit between the living space and the workshop. So yeah, all that is protected and covered and good to go. Now let's go over to the workshop. In here, everything on the walls are done. That's all covered. I just have to do that little section there, as far as the walls. And then the flat ceiling there is all done, covered and vapor barriered and everything. Now the only thing left I gotta do in here, this is the major job that I have left, is to do the rafters up there. So that has to be R19. I've got it right here. And I'm going to build some kind of janky scaffolding to bring me up pretty close to the ceiling. That way I don't have to reach up too far. I'll just be right up against the ceiling. And I'll be able to put on the insulation pretty easily, as well as a vapor barrier. So let's get to work. The reason I'm building scaffolding is, instead of buying another ladder, is because the taller ladder would be about $200 or probably closer to $300. And I built this scaffolding for less than $50. Plus, I can reuse the wood later. Also, I don't have much use for a standalone 12-foot ladder after this. It's a lot easier, and I can work faster on a raised platform. Anyway, I had many reasons to build this scaffolding of death. I used the power of triangles to give it stability. Having a diagonal on every side will help keep it from tipping over. I alternated the diagonals just to maybe give it more stability. This scaffolding is purely temporary, so I'm only doing what's necessary to get the next few steps done. I have to be able to move it around relatively easily, so I use these casters that I've been holding onto from Rockler that will allow me to pick up all 4 legs, roll it around, and set it back down. I think these are better for this situation, so it's not always resting on wheels. Lastly, I threw up a sheet of OSB as my main platform and screwed it to the skeleton. Also don't try this at home. This is sketchy and not recommended. Just buy a ladder. With the scaffolding assembled, I put the insulation in place in the vaulted ceiling. Having a platform to work on was much easier than having to move a ladder around 100 times. With one side done, and while running out of daylight, I put up a section of the vapor barrier. I rolled out a section about 12 feet long, a bit more than I needed, and brought it up to the platform. It gets attached with staples. Insulation comes in several forms. What I'm using for the most part is unfaced bats. This insulation does not have a vapor barrier, so it requires to have one installed afterwards. A vapor barrier is essentially that, a barrier for vapor, preventing it to transfer from outside to inside and vice versa. Now, obviously there can be some flaws in the system, like where the electrical outlets are and lights and such, but to my understanding it's pretty good at its job. I was required to put a vapor barrier on all my unfaced bats of insulation. Here, I'm taping the seams of the vapor barrier to minimize the flaws in the system. I didn't want to have a surplus of insulation, so whenever I needed to buy more, I bought faced insulation, like you see here. The vapor barrier is built right into the product, so no need to install one afterwards. There's a trade-off to this insulation. While it is more difficult to install compared to unfaced insulation that just tucks right in, I didn't have to fuss with the large sheet of plastic way up in the air. And for that reason, I decided to go with faced insulation when I needed more. After spending the last day or two dealing with large sections of plastic sheeting, I could use a break. Either way, once I was done taping all the seams, sealing up the vapor barrier as much as I could, the insulation was done, and we can move on to the next steps, which will be drywall and plywood interior walls. It's pretty cool to see some big steps being made in here. Man, I just can't wait for it to be done so I can get back to work on all the projects I want to do. Okay, that's it for now. See ya.